The stagecoach was still rocking on its springs when Cecily saw Ketch's face, and she understood immediately that the 4-day journey from Vancouver had been a terrible mistake. He was standing at the edge of the Shale Crossing depot. If a muddy platform and a leaning tin roof could be called a depot, with his thumbs hooked into his lapels and his expression doing the work of a man deciding whether to buy a lame horse. He had written to her in careful, courtly phrases. The letters had described a prosperous dry goods merchant, a man of moderate refinement who required a capable wife for his household. He had not, notably, described himself. Ketch Yardley was short. That wouldn't have bothered Cecily in the slightest. If he hadn't been looking at her with the naked disappointment of a man who'd ordered something from a catalogue and received the wrong item entirely. She stepped down from the coach with her valise in one hand and her ledger satchel in the other. She never travelled without her ledger satchel and faced him on the frozen mud of the platform. "You're the Brant woman." It wasn't a greeting. "I am Cecily." She offered her free hand. He didn't take it. "The agency wrote that you were handsome." He said it, the way a man states a discrepancy in an invoice. "The agency wrote that you were a man of good character," she replied, and kept her voice level, though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. "I suppose we've both been sold a story." His lip pulled. Around them, the small knot of Shale Crossing residents who had come to watch the stage arrive, and there were always people who came to watch the stage. It was the only entertainment some weeks, were going very still in that particular way of people who sense something worth remembering. "The arrangement's off." Ketch said it loudly, deliberately. He wanted witnesses. "You're not what I paid for. The agency took my money for a young woman who could sit in my parlour and be an asset to my reputation. What they sent me is a schoolmarm with ink stains on her cuffs." The ink stains were from correcting freight manifests on the coach. She had been doing it to calm her nerves. "I need someone who can manage a household," she started. "You look like you'd manage it into a courtroom." He picked up the small paper case he'd brought, the one she assumed held her return ticket, and put it back under his arm without opening it. "I'm not running a charity, Miss Brant. You can find your own way back." He turned around and walked off the platform. The sound of his boot heels on the boards was very loud in the sudden quiet. Cecily stood with her valise and her ledger satchel, and the cold came in fast from the mountains. The particular wet cold of the BC interior in late October that doesn't announce itself so much as simply arrive, like an unwelcome guest who knows the locks. She had 43 cents. The agency had taken the return portion of her travel money as a placement fee. She had known it was a risk. She had taken it anyway, because the alternative had been a boarding house in Vancouver she could no longer afford, work at a laundry that was slowly breaking her hands, and a city that had made abundantly clear it had no use for a woman who could balance a ledger but had no husband's name to borrow. The people on the platform began to murmur. Someone laughed. It was the short, mean kind of laugh, the kind that's really just relief that it's happening to someone else. The cold was working through her coat now. Her eyes were burning. "Nobody in this town wants me either," she thought. She hadn't meant to think it quite so plainly. It arrived like a diagnosis. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and stood very straight, because she had learned a long time ago that crying in public only gave people something to feel superior about, and she refused to give this town that. She didn't hear him approach. What she noticed first was that the laughing stopped, then the murmuring stopped, then the cold seemed to ease, not because the wind had dropped, but because something very large was blocking it. She looked up. The man standing 2 feet behind her was not the sort of man you catalogue quickly. He was enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, not in a way that seems chosen or performed, but simply structural, as though there hadn't been any other option. A heavy canvas coat hung from shoulders that had no business being that wide. His beard was dark with iron grey threaded through it. His eyes, when they finally settled on her face, were a pale, steady hazel that reminded her of the Fraser River in the shallows. Clear all the way down, and very cold, and utterly unimpressed with theatrics. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ketch Yardley, who had paused near the edge of the platform. When the silence had gotten too loud to ignore. "She's with me." The words were quiet. They didn't need to be loud. They fell into the air like timber. Ketch blinked. "Now see here, Gareth. You discarded her." The man's voice didn't change pitch publicly in front of witnesses. "That makes your claim void." He looked at Cecily, not at Ketch. "You have bags?" "One valise," she said, "and my satchel." He picked up her valise in one hand. He didn't ask permission. He didn't ask if she was coming. He just turned and began walking toward the far end of the platform. Cecily looked at Ketch, who was now a peculiar shade of aubergine. She looked at the townspeople, who were watching, with the particular, fascinated alertness of people who understand they are witnessing something they will be describing for years. Then she looked at the broad, retreating back of the man, who had just, without explanation or apparent effort, altered the entire mathematics of her afternoon. She followed him. His name was Gareth. He told her this in the Shale Crossing cookhouse, which was warm in the survivalist way of buildings that are serious about their purpose. Iron stove, low ceiling, no decoration, and a smell of wood smoke and rendered lard that would have been unpleasant anywhere else, but here felt deeply, specifically kind. He set her valise down and ordered her food without asking what she wanted, and what arrived was a plate of roast venison and boiled potatoes that she ate with an urgency she stopped trying to apologize for after the first 30 seconds. He drank black coffee and watched her with those still, river-shallow eyes. "You said I'm with you," she said when she could speak properly. "What does that mean, specifically?" "Exactly what it sounds like." He turned his mug between his hands. "Or nothing at all, if you prefer." I said it to shut Yardley up. He's the kind of man who only understands ownership. I gave him a concept he could follow. That's a remarkably cynical act of kindness. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile. The potential of one, maybe. "I have a timber operation," he said. 800 acres of Douglas fir on the north ridge above town, 31 men working the cut. I run the books myself. A pause. "Poorly." She looked at the ledger satchel on the bench beside her. "I need someone who can manage the accounts," he said. "Order supplies. Keep the log of the cut against the mill output. I've been losing money for 2 years, and I can't find where it's going." "You want a bookkeeper." "I want a partner." He said it the same way he said everything, flat and without ornamentation. "There's a difference. A bookkeeper does what they're told. A partner tells me when I'm wrong." Cecily studied him the way she had been trained, in her own instinctive way, to study figures. Not the ones they claimed to be, but the actual ones, the ones that revealed themselves in the gaps. "If we don't suit," he continued, "I'll pay your way out in the spring, $200, plus the value of your time." $200. She had never held that much money at one time in her life. "And if we do suit?" The hazel eyes didn't flicker. "Then you'd be making a different decision in the spring." She thought about Ketch Yardley's face when he'd said schoolmarm. She thought about Vancouver, about the laundry, about the ink stains on her cuffs. That apparently made her unfit for a parlor, but might. It was just possible make her exactly fit for 800 acres of Douglas fir that had been bleeding money for 2 years. "I'll want to see the ledgers tonight," she said. He nodded once. "We leave at first light." The road to the ridge camp was not a road. It was an argument with geography, a narrow track that switchbacked up through old-growth forest, so dense it reduced the October sky to a grey ribbon overhead. The wagon was heavy with supplies. Gareth drove the 2 Clydesdales with a quiet authority, a shift of the reins, a sound low in his throat that the horses seemed to understand perfectly. He didn't speak much. She had already noticed that he distributed words the way some men distributed money, carefully, without waste, and only when he was sure they'd do useful work. Cecily sat beside him on the bench with a blanket around her shoulders and the ledger satchel on her lap, and thought, for the first time since Vancouver, that she was not afraid. The camp, when they reached it, was loud and smelled of sawdust and horse sweat, and the particular electric sharpness of a steam boiler running at capacity. 31 men stopped and stared when the wagon rolled in. Cecily had grown accustomed to being stared at. At school, she'd been the girl who finished arithmetic first. At the laundry, she'd been the woman who kept the supply records. At the stage depot this morning, she'd been the woman nobody wanted. She was practiced at being looked at and found inconvenient. Gareth stood up on the wagon board and spoke without raising his voice. "This is Miss Brant. She's managing the accounts and the camp stores from here on. Any question about supply goes through her. Any man who can't conduct himself accordingly is welcome to find work in town." 31 men looked at one another. Nobody said a word. The cabin was set apart from the camp on a slight rise, a solid practical structure of squared logs that had all the warmth of a well-intentioned government pamphlet. It was clean in the sense that nothing was visibly rotting, but the stove had a cracked firebox door. The north-facing window let in a cold thread of air around the frame, and the table was buried under 18 months of receipts, invoices, and supply logs, written in Gareth's handwriting, which was large and frustrated-looking, like a man who found the pen personally offensive. Cecily stood in the middle of it and breathed in. Then she set her satchel on the chair, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. In the first week, she fixed the stove door with a piece of iron plate she found in the equipment shed and 3 bolts. She re-chinked the window frame with clay and dry moss. She established a filing system for the invoices using a method she had learned from an accountant at a shipping firm who had told her, not unkindly, that she was better with numbers than any man he'd hired, but that he couldn't pay her a man's wage because of what people would think. The numbers, at least, were consistent. They didn't care what she was. They only cared whether she was right. In the second week, she found the problem. Gareth was on the porch, sharpening a falling axe with long, steady strokes of a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, meditative. Cecily brought the camp's supply register to the door and stood there until he looked up. "Your factor in town," she said, "Ansel." His hands slowed. "He's been ordering for 38 men. You have 31. She turned the register to face him. "He logs the full delivery in your camp record and ships the surplus to the mining outfit on the west side of the ridge. He takes their payment and keeps it." She pointed to a column. "Since March, roughly $90 a month. Call it 650 since he started." The temperature on the porch did something that had nothing to do with the weather. Gareth stood. He was very still. For a moment, the way things are still just before they stop being still. He set the axe down carefully, picked up his coat, and looked at her. "Lock the door tonight," he said. He was back by morning. He didn't explain what had happened in the hours between. He sat down at the table with his coffee and looked at the register for a long time without speaking. "From now on," he said at last, "supply orders go out with your name on them." It was not, on the surface, a remarkable sentence, but Cecily, who had spent her adult life being told that her competence was inconvenient, understood exactly what it meant. He was handing her the operational authority of his livelihood, not as a favor, not as a compliment on her hair, as recognition of a simple, demonstrated fact. She was better at this than he was, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. She took the register back. "I'll need a proper ledger book. The current one is full." Make a list, he said. Ansell's replacement goes to town Thursday. Something shifted between them after that. The cabin, which had been large and impersonal, began to take on the particular quality of a space where two people have learned each other's rhythms. Gareth worked from before dawn to after dark. In the evenings he sat by the stove and read, or worked on equipment, or simply sat in that self-contained silence of his that she'd initially found unnerving and had come to find, without quite meaning to, restful. Cecily kept the books by lamplight and wrote letters to the Vancouver suppliers that got them better rates by the simple method of presenting accurate production data and refusing to accept the first offer. In November, a widowmaker came down in the high section of the cut. She heard the shout from the camp below and was already at the door when two of the men came up the rise with Gareth between them, his left arm held against his side, a dark stain spreading through the shoulder of his canvas shirt. The men looked uncertain. Cecily did not. Bring him inside. Chair by the stove, you. Put water on. The gash was deep, angled across the muscle of his upper arm where the branch had caught him. She cut the sleeve away without asking, cleaned the wound with the whiskey she'd specifically added to the medical stores. She'd found no medical provisions in the camp whatsoever, which had appalled her, and threaded a needle. This will be unpleasant, she told him. I know what stitches feel like, he said, though his jaw was set hard enough that she could see the muscles working. Good, she began. You need a better protocol for high-section cutting. The men should be checking the canopy before they work under those old firs. Dead wood doesn't announce itself. You've been studying the cut? His voice was strained but even. I've been studying everything. She tied off the third stitch. I can't balance accounts I don't understand. I need to know where the expenses are generated before I can tell you whether they're justified. He looked at her. She was very close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting into distance and weather. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, not the way he looked at the registers, assessing and practical, but something quieter than that. Something that made the warmth from the stove feel more immediate than it had a moment ago. You could have been a foreman, he said. I could have been a great many things, Cecily replied, tying off the final stitch. She stood back. Don't use that arm for a week. That's not. 1 week, she repeated. The tone of her voice settled the matter. He was quiet, then so quietly she almost missed it. Thank you, Cecily. She turned away to clean her hands because she didn't trust her face at that particular moment. Thank me by enforcing the canopy inspection protocol I'm writing up for the high-section crew. From behind her, something that was almost, very nearly, a laugh. Winter deepened. The snow came down from the ridge in earnest, sealing the camp from the world, in a way that should have felt threatening, but didn't. Cecily had always been good at solitude. What she hadn't known was that there was a version of it that wasn't lonely, that was instead simply quiet and productive, and shared with someone who understood the value of a thing done well. She tried not to think about the spring. March came anyway. The pass opened on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, Cecily was at the cabin table with the finished ledgers in front of her and a small tin box that had appeared on the corner of the desk 2 days prior. She hadn't opened it. She knew what was in it. Gareth had said $200 and passage home, and Gareth said exactly what he meant. She was still staring at the box when she heard the horses. 2 of them, moving fast for the grade. She went to the window. Ketch Yardley, and beside him, a man in a suit that had not been intended for mountain mud, carrying a leather document case. Her stomach dropped. They didn't knock. Ketch never had that particular instinct for courtesy. "Where's Gareth?" he said, looking at her with the contempt that belongs to men who've been forced to revise their own importance downward. "State your business." Ketch's companion opened his case. I'm with the Provincial Land Office. Mr. Gareth holds his timber lease under a territorial grant requiring lawful domestic conduct on the premises. Our position is that an unmarried woman residing in a single man's camp constitutes a violation of that condition. He laid a paper on the table. The lease is suspended pending review, as Mr. Yardley is the secondary claimant on the original survey. He's entitled to file for interim management of the cutting operation until the matter's resolved. It was elegant in a rotten way. Ketch couldn't beat Gareth in the valley, so he'd found a legal mechanism to do it from the outside. That woman came here under a contract with me, Ketch said, pointing. She's still technically my responsibility under the agency terms. I can have her removed for breach. You publicly renounced the contract, Cecily said. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised at how steady it was, in front of no fewer than 11 witnesses. Doesn't matter, Ketch said. The point is your Gareth has been operating outside the conduct conditions of his grant. The land officer here agrees. The land officer looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Cecily thought about the ledgers on the table. She thought about 6 months of careful work, the supply lines she'd negotiated, the fraud she'd stopped, the accounts now running clean and black instead of bleeding quietly into Ansell's pocket. She thought about the tin box with $200 in it, sitting on the corner of the desk, like a question she hadn't answered yet. She heard the door. Gareth didn't come in loudly. He simply came in, and the room reorganized itself around him the way rooms did. He was carrying a logging chain over one shoulder, covered in mud to the knee, and looking at Ketch Yardley with an expression that Cecily recognized from mathematics, the expression of someone who has already done the calculation and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He set the chain down. It hit the floor with a sound that made both Ketch and the land officer flinch. You'll want to read this first, Gareth said. He was not speaking to Ketch. He reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the table, next to the suspension notice. The land officer opened it. His expression changed. Cecily picked it up. It was a marriage registration, dated the 15th of February, filed through the provincial office in Victoria, submitted by post at the beginning of the month. Her name, Gareth's name. The land officer cleared his throat. This appears to be legitimate. It is, Gareth said. He hadn't looked at Cecily yet. He was still looking at Ketch. The conduct condition of the lease is satisfied. The suspension is void, and so is your interim claim. He picked up the suspension notice and held it out to the land officer. You'll want to record that. Ketch's face moved through several colors. You can't simply file a registration without. She can contest it, Gareth said flatly. She's entitled to. I'll make no argument if she chooses to. He finally looked at her, just looked. No performance in it. Get off my land, he said to Ketch, and then, to the land officer, with considerably more civility, I'll walk you out. The cabin was empty, except for the two of them, the chain on the floor, and the marriage registration in her hands. Cecily set it on the table. She was very quiet for a moment. February 15th, she said. Yes. That was 5 weeks ago. Yes. She looked up. You didn't ask me. Gareth was very still. He didn't try to argue the point or soften it. No, he said, I didn't. I am not a line item in a supply order. The anger came up clean and sudden. The way clean anger does when it has been gathering under a long winter of careful composure. I spent 6 months here proving I could be trusted with every decision that matters to this operation. You gave me signing authority on the accounts. You told me a partner tells you when you're wrong. She took a step toward him. You were wrong. You should have asked me. He stood there and took it with the same solidity with which he took everything. Not passively, but actually listening. You're right, he said. I know I am. I knew Ansel would run to Yardley when I removed him. I knew Yardley would find a way to use it. I filed the registration to stop him before he could move. He stopped. He looked for the first time genuinely uncertain. On a man his size, it was startling. I didn't think to ask because it didn't occur to me that you might want to leave. The anger didn't disappear, but it shifted slightly, the way the light shifts in late afternoon, revealing a different set of shadows. "The tin box," she said. "The money's yours. It was always going to be yours. I put it there so you'd know the door was open, so that if you stayed, it was because you chose to, not because you were cornered." He was careful with the words, the way he was careful with everything. "I'm not good at explaining what I want, Cecily. I know how to fall a tree and keep a boiler from exploding and judge which claims are worth filing. I never learned the other vocabulary." She looked at him. His coat was still wet from the mud. There was a healed scar on his forearm, where she'd stitched him in November. "What do you want?" she said quietly. The hazel eyes were very direct. "I want you to stay. Not because the books need managing, and not because Yardley needed stopping. I want you to stay because this place was functional before you arrived, and it's been something else since. I couldn't have told you what was missing until it was here." He paused. "I'm telling you now, because you deserve the honest version." The stove was warm. Outside, the March melt was beginning, the slow drip and rush of the snow coming off the ridge, the valley opening up from its long white silence. Cecily picked up the marriage registration. She looked at it for a long moment. "You still should have asked me," she said. "I know. And your canopy inspection protocol for the high section crew is still not being consistently enforced. I checked the log this morning." Something crossed his face, a smile, small and real and startled, as though it had arrived before he'd thought to stop it. "I'll speak to the foreman." "I'll write it up," she said, "so there's no ambiguity." She set the paper down. She looked up at him. "I'm not going anywhere." He crossed the room. He was not a man who performed gestures, and so the ones he did make carried their full weight. His hand came up and touched the side of her face, rough and very careful, the hand of someone who has spent years handling things that matter and knows the difference between grip and gentleness. "I owe you an asking," he said. "You do," she didn't pull away. "Ask me." He did. In the weeks that followed, Cecily renegotiated the camp's timber contracts with the Vancouver buyers, increasing the mill rate by 14% through the simple method of presenting accurate production data and refusing the first offer. The men who had initially been uncertain about her presence came to understand that the woman in the camp office was the reason their wages arrived on time and their provisions were correct, and they adjusted their opinion accordingly, the way practical people adjust their opinions when the evidence is clear enough. Ketch made one attempt to contest the marriage registration through a provincial solicitor. The solicitor reviewed Cecily's documentation of the original contract renunciation, 12 named witnesses, 3 written statements, and advised against proceeding. Ansel was formally charged. The evidence was the ledger she had built, page by careful page, over a winter of lamplight. On the first warm evening of May, Cecily sat on the porch of the cabin with the accounts for the quarter across her lap. The mountains, still carrying snow in the high couloirs, the valley below green and loud with meltwater and birdsong. Gareth sat in the other chair. He was looking at the mountains with the particular focused quiet of a man who is thinking about something and finding his way to it slowly. "Nobody in Shale Crossing wanted you," he said finally. He wasn't looking at her. "No," she agreed. "I've been thinking about that." A pause. They were looking at the wrong thing. Cecily looked at the accounts, then at the ridge, then at the man sitting beside her. The man who had looked at the right thing when she was standing on a frozen platform, with 43 cents and an ink stain on her cuff, and had made a decision accordingly. She had been told her whole life that her value was incidental. Something to be tolerated if it came attached to the right face, or the right name, or the right silence. She didn't believe that anymore. The mountains held the last light for a long time before they finally let the evening come, and she was home.